Let me show you how to be a good Bayesian.
Did you know there is a novel out there about Bayesian statistics? It even has a great title, The Bayesian Hitman, and an even greater author, Robert Kubinec. When I heard about that, I, of course, had to invite Bob on the show. An assistant professor at the University of South Carolina, Bob's research focuses on wealth creation and democratization, causal inference, and Bayesian statistics. In this episode, Bob takes us through his fascinating journey from working in government to pursuing a career in academia, exploring his current work on measuring corruption and how Bayesian methods help in estimating latent variables. This is Learning Bayesian Statistics, episode 119, recorded October 8, 2024.
Let me show you how to be a good Bayesian. Change your predictions after taking information in. And if you're thinking I'll be less than amazing, let's adjust those expectations. What's a Bayesian? It's someone who cares about evidence.
Welcome to Learning Bayesian Statistics, a podcast about Bayesian inference, the methods, the projects, and the people who make it possible. I'm your host, Alex Andorra. You can follow me on Twitter at Alex_Andorra, like the country. For any info about the show, learnbayesstats.com is la place to be. Show notes, becoming a corporate sponsor, unlocking Bayesian merch, supporting the show on Patreon, everything is in there. That's learnbayesstats.com. If you're interested in one-on-one mentorship, online courses, or statistical consulting, feel free to reach out and book a call at topmate.io/Alex_Andorra. See you around, folks, and best Bayesian wishes to you all. And if today's discussion sparked ideas for your business, well, our team at PyMC Labs can help bring them to life. Check us out at pymc-labs.com.
Hello, my dear Bayesians. Today, I want to welcome two new patrons in the Learn Bayes Stats family. Thank you so much to Rasmus Hinstrom and to the mysterious Stefan. Your support truly makes this show possible. I can't wait to talk with you in the Slack channel, and I hope you will enjoy being there and talking about everything Bayes. Okay, on to the show now. Bob Kubinec, welcome to Learning Bayesian Statistics.
Thank you, Alex. It's so great to be on here. Thanks so much for inviting me.
Yeah, that's awesome. And I also really love how that episode came around because I discovered your book, your novel, which is your first novel. We'll talk about that during the show, which is called The Bayesian Hitman. Of course, everybody should go and check it out. It will be in the show notes.
Okay.
And so I discovered that book when I was at StanCon a few weeks ago. And I recorded a bunch of two live episodes. And then, of course, afterwards you go for a drink. And I was having a drink with, I think it was Francis D'Italia and Richard McElreath. And we started, we were talking about Bayes stuff. And I don't know why at some point Francis mentioned your book. And I was like, or Richard, I don't remember. And I was like, wait, there is a novel about that's based around Bayes statistics. I need to have that person on the show. So, that's how it came. That's how it came to my knowledge. And then Francis, I think tagged you on Twitter and we talked a bit, on Twitter and here we are. So that's definitely one of the most random episodes that I've ever done.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And hopefully Richard McElreath does read my novel because I would love to get his feedback on it. His textbook, for many people, for me, it was very influential in doing Bayesian statistics. And he's an excellent writer. I don't know if he's written any fiction. The fun thing I will say about writing a novel, what's unusual about it isn't actually so much that I wrote a novel. There actually are a fair number of novels written by academics. It's more that I wrote it under my actual name. There's some untold number of academics that are publishing under pen names. So which is really fun. So next time you see a book that's anonymous, it could be by an academic. For me, I use my real name because the book actually is also about academia, even about the work that I do. And I wanted, I wanted people in the field to read it. Like that was part of the fun of writing it. So if I, so that's why it's under my actual name, not some cool made up name.
Okay. Well, that's already interesting. I wasn't aware of that at all. So, yeah, we'll definitely get back to that. But that's my job here to do the teasing, so, stay tuned for more about why Bob wrote the book. But first, let's talk about your origin, story and all that, because you have a very interesting one. But first, as usual, can you tell us what you're doing nowadays?
Yeah, so I'm assistant professor of political science at the University of South Carolina. I just started here. Before this, I was at New York University, Abu Dhabi, in the United Arab Emirates for 5 years. I did my PhD at the University of Virginia, and I did a 1-year postdoc at Princeton. My work here, so in political science, I'm what they call a political economist. So I study a lot of, what I tell people is you take kind of the worst parts about political science and economics, and you put them together, and you've got political economy. So it's all like analyzing things like corruption, money in politics, business influence over politics. And maybe on the brighter side, I do some work on economic development. I have a big project right now studying entrepreneurship in developing countries and how young people can kind of get more involved. But yeah, I do a lot of these sort of dark money. And the connection really to Bayesian statistics is that a lot of the stuff that I study is very, very hard to measure. And a lot of my work in Bayesian statistics deals with measurement and using models, especially latent variable models, and very difficult measurement problems. And how do you find an estimate? I was just writing a reviewer response today about this. How do you find an estimate of something that's hard to study, that you can't directly observe, that kind of best incorporates everything you know? And Bayesian frameworks are really, I think, best at that. But yeah, so I roughly half of my research is sort of, let's say, statistical in nature, making new models, especially in measurement modeling. And then the other half is sort of empirical, like going out into the real world and trying to discover new things about political economy.
That is super fun. So you mean that people don't self-declare that they are corrupted or corrupting someone?
Yeah,
Weird.
it's yeah, it is really strange. And corruption is this really fun thing to study, precisely because how do you get people to admit to it, right? There's this whole field of what they call sensitive survey questions, which is if someone has done something wrong or illegal, how can you get them to admit that on a survey in a way that and in some sense it's sort of, you talk about things that are unobservable. It's very hard to observe someone doing something completely illegal or unethical, because sort of by definition, if it's illegal, they're not going to do it in front of other people, or they're not going to admit to it. So you have this sort of, big central problem of, how do you determine, or how do you study social behavior that you can't observe, right? It's a complex issue. But.
Yeah, for sure. But that sounds that sounds fascinating. Maybe you can talk a bit about that, then we'll go back to your origin story. But since we're talking about that, actually, how do you do that? Then how do you make people admit that they did something wrong without having them admit it? Do you use hypnosis? Do you what are you using, Bob?
So there's kind of two approaches. One is to rely on sort of government data, and this they do a lot in developed democracies. So primarily the EU and the United States, and that's because in these countries they have enough regulatory capability that they can force people to report. So like in the US and the EU, there are like lobbying registries, right, where every time a business deals with a politician, there's some record of it. Also, even when there's not a record of things, there's so much data available. For example, there's a lot of work on contracting. So people will, get access to the records of all the government contracts that have been issued in a certain country, and then search through them and try to find companies that have political connections to certain politicians. And there, it's tricky because you can't necessarily prove that there was a corrupt transaction or something like this. But let's say if you see that companies that have many more, that have someone on the board who was a former member of parliament, if they get contracts at a higher rate relative to other companies that don't, that's sort of that suggestive thing. So that's kind of one way of doing it. And the other is through, trying, and this is more what I do, which is trying to directly collect information about corruption and these sorts of issues. And that's a lot about trying to assure people some kind of anonymity, confidentiality. And I do a lot of online survey research, which is better at confidentiality, because if you can fill out something on your phone or in your computer by yourself, I've done a lot of getting employees to talk about what their companies do. So they don't necessarily have to report that they themselves did a corrupt transaction, but do you know if your business, right, is, working with some political parties or has offered, do you know if your, boss or CEO seems to be involved in some kind of transactions with political parties, which happens all the time in developing countries. And anyway, yeah. So that's how I've been really getting at it. Lately, I've been experimenting. I kind of mentioned sensitive survey questions, and these are really fun. And they're basically ways of trying to encrypt a survey. So encryption uses keys, right? And so there's a method called randomized response. And I actually have a blog post about this. I have a recent study that I did in Tunisia using this, where essentially you use a key. The key is the respondent's birthday. So you ask the respondent, were you born in these 3 months of the year? And then you ask them a question that combines that answer, which is random, right? With the actual, so you say, if you were born, so you say, did you, let's say, give a bribe or something, or, do this sensitive thing? The answer is you did that, or you were born in these 3 months of the year. And the other answer is, yes, I did it, or something like that. What you do is you combine this natural randomness from this question that's irrelevant but random with the actual thing you're trying to measure. And just like, encryption that you use, on a computer or whatever, it's actually the same process. Because I don't know the respondent's birthday, I don't know their true answer. But when I take all that data, because I know the proportion of people in the population who are born in those 3 months of the year, which is roughly uniform, you can then back out what the population estimate is, the latent estimate. So there's some really clever, very counterintuitive methods. And so I'm experimenting with some of these now, and yeah, doing things like that. But
this is super fun. Yeah.
Yeah.
Sounds a bit like also, detective work. So
yeah.
That's really fun.
Yeah. Anti-corruption research is fun. It's extremely difficult and difficult to get data, and often you're kind of guessing with what you can gather, but I do enjoy it a lot. Yeah.
Yeah. That makes me think a bit of a project I worked with some researchers from Dalhousie University. That sounds very different, but it made me think of it because they were trying to infer the trade of shark meat across, between countries, and but trying to do it at the species level. And countries don't have to report the species they trade; they have to report the species they fish, but not the species they trade. And the thing is, there are some species they cannot trade, and so of course they can report the species that the species for trade, but they don't always do it. And so okay, if they don't do it, does that mean they are trading some species they are not supposed to? And so actually the whole work was to try and infer from both the trade data and the landings data, so the fishing data, which species are actually traded by which country to which country. And so that's a bit like this, where you don't have, it's based on the data is based on self-reports. The reports are not very constraining, so you have to do all that detective work, and that's where also the Bayesian methods are very powerful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, totally. Yeah, and that's where I've gotten a lot of leverage from them in my own work is, and I think too, because most Bayesian models have a frequentist analog, and and for a lot of people that's like, well, I don't really see the difference. When you're running a regression model, often there really isn't, right? If it's like a maximum likelihood, simple linear regression model. But where the Bayesian methods really shine is when you're studying some latent quantity, and especially when you have prior information about that, because when you have some, let's say, very subtle prior information, like let's say, experts think that the wildlife trade isn't higher than like this threshold, but there's uncertainty. You're not sure exactly what the threshold is, if you do your work with Stan and everything, you can include that information basically almost directly into the model, right? In a way that will give you much better estimates than starting from some population sampling perspective. And that's, I'd say my favorite projects, the ones that where Bayesian approaches have been so helpful are those where you have this subtle prior information. And that's where Bayes can really shine. The flip side, of course, is it's not easy. I'm sure, that it's not easy to do that type of modeling. And especially when you start, deriving custom models, custom distributions, it's intense. It can take a long time. But the answer can be, just so much better than alternatives, because it's just so much more nuanced. And, I could preach on this topic for a long time, but.
No, I mean, that's great. Although you would be preaching to the choir here.
Which is great. That's wonderful.
Yeah, no, for sure. But yeah, that just sounds super fun. And I'm happy that I was able also to bring up that project, because that fish project, that shark trade project, will have one of the main authors on the show very soon in November, Aaron McNeil from Dalhousie University, with whom I've worked on this project and the whole team. So stay tuned, guys, for that episode. That's going to be a very fun one. Aaron is a very good communicator, and also a very interesting person to talk to. So it should be a very cool episode. But let's get back to you, Bob, because I said that you had a very interesting origin story, very original one. And that's because when so to prepare the show, I, of course, stalk all my future guests, right? I hope you understand. Yeah. And while stalking you, I saw that you've transitioned from working at IBM and the US Department of State to now academia, which is what you just said. So I love that. How did that happen?
Yeah, no, life takes a lot of twists and turns. And so I'd say essentially for the first part of my career, I was very wanted to work in government, especially in foreign affairs. Life change. Course changes are always a bit complicated. I did one tour with the State Department in Saudi Arabia, and a lot of my research is in the Middle East, North Africa, so that that hasn't really changed a whole lot. But there were things that I loved about the State Department, and some of my colleagues, just really amazing people. Personally, actually, when I was finishing my master's degree at George Washington, which was at a policy school, it wasn't a program that was really emphasizing preparation for PhD. But I did some research there as, part of my thesis sort of thing. And I realized I had this sort of, epiphany that I actually really like doing research. It was this eureka moment. And what I also really came to value was independence. And I think you can probably see some of that with my academic trajectory, that I like to work on the things that I work on, and I like to kind of take different approaches. And the State Department is a giant bureaucracy. And kind of has to be. Its job is to implement legislation and all this stuff. And I just sort of personally realized that I would do better in a sort of less structured environment, which, there's still rules in universities and stuff, but relatively speaking, it's much less structured. You work in smaller teams, and your work is really more your own. And so I really valued that. So that was part of it. And the other part was personal. My fiance at the time was in the US, and she was studying in a graduate program. And the State Department, you have to have worldwide availability. You have to go wherever they tell you to go. And they were going to next send me to Mexico. That was the closest that they could send me back to the States. And I talked to them. I was like, my fiance she's in Virginia and Richmond in the US. And they said, oh, yeah, we're sending you to Mexico. Because in the State Department world, that's close. You're in the same hemisphere. Yeah. But it's not that close. And I was like, it was a combination of that and then getting accepted to the PhD program at the University of Virginia. So it was all these things combined. And honestly, there are definitely challenges to work in academia, I'm sure you're familiar with. But I really think I made the right choice, at least for me. I really do enjoy the freedom and flexibility of academia. That's probably why I've stuck with it. And one thing I really care a lot about is, open science and transparency. And unfortunately, those aren't always hallmarks of academia, but I do think that at least, in principle, we have the ability to be much more honest and transparent than people in government. And so that's one thing I've always really enjoyed about academic research is, the ability to just sort of be upfront about what you think, release your conclusions, without a lot of political pressure to change them.
Yeah. This is really interesting, and when I can definitely relate to that background because it's also what happened to me. I was working at the French Central Bank, so it's not the Department of State, but I actually worked a bit before the Central Bank for the French Foreign Ministry. Definitely had the same experience, so that's
interesting. Okay.
Yeah.
Cool.
And then for sure, getting much more autonomy and freedom in not only what I do, but how I do it is definitely something I tremendously appreciate since then, and for sure I've never looked back since that time. But I'm curious though, how did your background, in the State Department influence your research methodologies in political science? How much of a back and forth is there between the work you did once and the work you're doing now?
Yeah, I think that where you start out has a lot of influence. That's where you train. Those are the questions you're exposed to. And absolutely, working at the State Department influenced a lot of the stuff I worked on later. And part of it simply might be that I tend to work on sort of what they call policy relevant topics. So most of my research is very contemporary Middle East issues. I have colleagues who do a lot of amazing, historical research. It can be really fascinating stuff, but the long-term influence of history on the contemporary world. And I don't. I tend to focus more on what's kind of currently developing or happening in different countries. I certainly do spend time writing for a policy audience. So written for Washington Post, Carnegie Endowment, something in the Brookings Institution. So I could certainly do more of that, but I do, and I think too that it probably influences my writing style, which tends to kind of focus on simplifying things and making them clear. And that was certainly, when I was a diplomat, that was very much stressed because you're writing for a policymaker audience, and you cannot use lots of jargon. You cannot give them ideas they can't digest in 30 seconds because that's all the time they have. And so there's a lot real focus on being short to the point. I think I benefited from that. I think it also, yeah, definitely influences the way that I do things. And I think too that I came into my PhD program and definitely into sort of the statistical quantitative world with a very non-traditional background. So the State Department is like the least quantitative place in the world. Like it's all diplomats who, just sort of know a little bit about everything and, write, pieces that just reflect their experience. And I think honestly, my feeling is that coming into my program with that background was actually super helpful, because I wasn't sort of locked into existing paradigms. So I had studied some statistics prior to grad school, but not very much. And so when I kind of came around to being introduced to Bayesian methods, I was just like, oh, this is great, and I think too that it's led me to question things maybe in a way that I wouldn't have otherwise. And a lot of my papers and projects in the statistics world have often come out of me kind of questioning things and thinking that things are unclear, and wanting to know why that's the case. So I think too, and if there's people listening to this podcast, let's say, who are just starting out in the world of statistics and don't have that background, they didn't grow up doing, let's say, the math Olympiad, or playing chess all the time, or whatever the stereotype is, that's really fine. And there's a lot that you can contribute. Like I really think almost anyone can do statistics or data science. They're going to do it differently. They're going to stress different things. They're going to learn differently. They're going to communicate differently. But you can make a contribution. And part of it is just that as people, we think differently. And if you think, somewhat differently than the average statistician, that actually can be a really good thing, especially when you're doing research, because research is all about finding solutions, right? And if you want to find a solution, it has to be something that no one else has thought of yet. So, I think that for me, it's actually been really fun being a statistician without that background. It's also been at times intimidating. So you mentioned StanCon. I went to the first StanCon in 2018, and that was also really the first time that I had presented at like these political methodology conferences, so like conferences where you have a lot of quantitative social scientists. But it was definitely my first presentation at like that had a math stats focus, and I was just absolutely petrified. That someone like Andy Gilman was gonna, ask me this horrifically hard question about posterior, driving the analytical posterior distribution or something, and I was just gonna kind of collapse on stage. And that didn't happen, and I had a lot of fun, and and I even had time to talk to some of the stand devs and ask them these like deep questions about Hamiltonian Monte Carlo, and I didn't really understand the answers, but it was still fun. So yeah, I think that reputation of kind of intimidation and stuff is not good for the field, but when people get past that, it actually can be a lot of fun. Yeah.
I definitely, I mean, I agree with everything you just said, and definitely recommend people to check out events like StanCon. They're really absolutely fantastic.
Totally. Yeah.
And as I said, I recorded 2 live episodes there. They are not out yet at the time where your episode is going to be out, because they require a bit more editing. But they will drop in your feed, folks, in a few weeks.
Cool.
But yeah, that's just a fantastic experience, because a lot of the Stan developers are there, and you can ask them, all the questions that you want, that you think are stupid, but actually are very interesting. And yeah, I get that it can be intimidating, but that's the great thing of that Bayesian community. From the beginning, I found that it's a very welcoming community. And as you were saying, you started going into that world without a math degree, or an engineering degree. And it's the same for me. I studied management and political science. So for a long time, I was, kind of fearing that part of my background, with a lot of imposter syndrome. But as you're saying, actually that can make you an interesting statistician, precisely because you haven't gone through the the classic way to statistics. So for sure, you're not gonna weigh in on the mass adaptation matrix routines if you don't want to, because that's clearly another wheelhouse. But you'll have a lot to say on a lot of other topics, especially applied statistics, which in the end is extremely important, because like all these software are here to be applied to use cases.
Yeah, and I think for listeners, and I'm sure you talk about this more, but if you are interested in Bayesian statistics in general and getting into it, the Stan community is the place to be. There's a discourse site that you can post questions about using Stan. But if you just simply dig up a lot of the documentation that they've made, both for Stan, but also they have these case studies online, they're excellent. And a lot of this has to do really with Andy Gilman. And Andy, his own writing, if you read his articles, are very clear. And that always set him apart in the statistics world for this love of clarity, this love of simplicity over formal notation and dense impenetrable text. And that has really defined the Stan community as well. I don't know if it's as much, the Stan is now so big. I kind of started out relatively early in it. And part of it was, so John Kropko was sort of my stats advisor at UVA, and he did a 2-year postdoc with Andy Gelman's team as they were developing the first edition of Stan. So I was sort of exposed to it relatively early on. And it, back then the community was small enough that it was a Google group, and people really knew each other if they posted on there. And now it's a lot bigger, but I think that ethos is still there. And I, really encourage people that, to post, to ask questions. Not that, obviously people can always be rude to newcomers and things, but it really is if you're going to start somewhere, it's a great place to start, because the ethos is, how can we include more people? I was just looking at the Stan, they were talking about how they were talking about how they're measuring who goes to StanCon and who has sort of a non-traditional background and stuff like this. And that's because they care about that, and a lot of people don't. So that's a beautiful thing. And I think Stan has been responsible really for raising the level of statistical literacy really across the entire applied statistics community, because they're smart, they do amazing work, but they also explain things, right? There's certain models that I know how they work because of the Stan documentation, because it's just a lot clearer and to the point. That's, and I think I honestly think there's actually a fair amount of bad vibes against Stan in the Bayesian statistics world among people who were kind of around before it, are attached to different older style methods. But I think part of it too is they don't like the vibe, like anyone can do this, we can help anyone understand. That's not popular in all circles. I'll just say that. Yeah.
Damn, yeah, that's the first time I hear that. But that's good to know. Yeah, and for sure, completely second everything you just said. If you're coming from the Python world, I also definitely encourage you to look at the PyMC community. That's where I started. So the PyMC discourse mainly is a great place to get your questions answered. Also answer some questions yourself, because that's really how you're gonna learn. So I definitely make use of all that open source community and make some PRs. PRs are always welcome. I can tell you that.
Yep.
And I'm actually curious also, Bob, before we switch to your novel, to talking about your novel, how first, do you remember when you were first introduced to Bayesian stats? And also, if these methods have shaped your research approach in political science?
Yep. Yeah. Good. Yeah. I should talk about like some of my actual work in this field as part of this podcast. Yeah. So it's really funny, but my first project. So I was working on this paper that I had to do in grad school. That was like a capstone paper for my one of my minors. It was like a applied statistic, field concentration. So I had to write this paper, and I was doing mixture modeling. And I think the funny thing about this project is that it was in many ways like a failure. Because if you've ever played around with mixtures, mixtures of Gaussians, mixtures of other distributions, there are these horrific sort of identification issues. And I was trying to fit a model where I had to like identify certain clusters in the data, or I was trying to do this with mixture modeling. And it just wasn't working. So essentially my advisor, I was using a frequentist package, R package called FlexMix. I remember this very distinctly. And it was just basically every time I ran it, I got a different result. And that was because of having a multimodal likelihood. There wasn't a single solution. And so the algorithm would end up in a different place each time. And this was driving me nuts. So then I switched to Stan, fairly, early version of Stan at the time. But there was sufficient documentation of mixture modeling. And the funny thing was the model didn't actually work any better in Stan. But it was doing it in Stan that I actually understood the model, right? And after beating my head against the wall for a few months, I was like, oh, I understand. Like, yes, of course, this model is not identified. A mixture is, without sufficient prior information about the location of the mixtures, like you don't know where they are. You don't. And so that was sort of my gateway drug. And then I was like, then I read McElrea's text, like when because it had, I was just lucky, we all lucky. It came out just as his first edition came out just as I was starting out, and I was using Twitter, which, now is, let's say, not as useful as it was, but these social media things are useful. I appeared on social media. People were like, oh, wow, this is really different. And I got it, and it just blew me away. I mean, just the clarity, the simplicity, how he connected a lot of things that I had thought of before. And, I think after reading it, I went from being like, oh, this is cool, to really being a little bit more of a zealot. This is how we should do research. This can really make a big difference. And then, of course, I also read, like the canonical Bayesian data analysis. That the first time I went through it, it was a little intense. McElrea's text is definitely more approachable. But then a lot of my learning was, this like informal case studies, blog posts, people sharing online, people answered my questions on the forum. That was all super, super helpful. And ultimately what I really got into, so I have two R packages that are Bayesian modeling. One is called ORD-beta-reg, or ordered beta regression. And this is a model that we don't have to go all into the weeds, but traditional beta regression is supposed to be a model of proportions, but the beta distribution can't handle observations, so-called at the bounds, meaning if your proportion goes from 0 to 1, you can't include any observations that have a 0 or a 1. And ordered beta regression is basically a compound model where one part is a beta distribution and the other part is actually a simple sort of ordered logit. That allows the model to include those. So there's two cut points in the model, like an ordered logistic regression. And you have one linear model, and you can include, basically, the model has sort of three components: 0, anything between 0 and 1, and then 1. And the payoff to the model, and it's getting a lot of exposure, is that it's a pretty simple model. It's not much more complicated than beta regression, but you can include an outcome that has zeros and ones, or 0 and 100, or whatever your scale is. And that's very useful for people, especially in the social sciences. My other, and that one's available, it's really a wrapper around BRMS to allow people to fit these types of models. And that's out on Crayon and everything. The other one is much more ambitious and is actually just coming to fruition, and it's called Ideal Stan. And ideal there comes from a social science model called the ideal point model. which is itself a variant of something called item response theory, which people have come across. It's from psychometrics. And what I've been doing is sort of expanding and generalizing this model using Stan. And what it allows people to do, and I've used it for multiple papers and publications already, but I've never released like the final version, is it allows you to apply what's essentially a very general purpose measurement model to all kinds of distributions of data that people couldn't before. So one of the big innovations is non-ignorable missing data. Like when you're fitting a latent variable model or any kind of measurement model, missing data is really, really tough because missing data is essentially its own latent problem. When you have missing data and a latent variable, what do you do, right? So this package has like a way of dealing with that in a way that avoids bias in your estimate of the latent variable. But it also has a bunch of other things. So Stan is really good at time. So there's a lot of work I've done on time varying latent variables. And that's particularly useful nowadays because as social scientists and or data scientists, we're getting so much more time varying data, right? From Twitter. Well, I guess not anymore from Twitter, but there's plenty of data sets that have, and it can get, time stamped right down into seconds. And if you want to estimate some latent quality from that, like let's say you want to know about, you could do corruption or like, polarization or some other quantity, and it's noisy. How do you handle that that variation over time, especially when you have these like sparse data sets, right? Like you have only a few observations in a given time window, but your time series is really long. So that's the kind of stuff I've been working on, and I'm hoping to finally release a final version of that by the end of this year. Knock on wood. And I've already used it for a range of things. It's really useful for survey data sets when you have like missing data. Like I used it to measure essentially people's wealth from a survey when there was a lot of missing data in different variables in the survey. I've used it to measure countries' policy responses to COVID-19 when there's a lot of complexity in how they respond and which countries are the most prepared. And yeah, so on and so forth. So that package hopefully will be out soon, and that uses Stan. That uses like raw Stan code in an R framework. I know it sounds like you're a Python guy, so in principle, you can estimate in Python as well, but that would have to be a future project. But those are my big kind of Bayesian method stuff. I have a new paper out. The Journal of the Royal Statistical Society that fits a big Bayesian measurement model in Stan to measure COVID infections in the U.S. in the early pandemic period. So, and this is talking about prior information, how useful it is in the U.S. context. Most countries, right, during the early part of COVID, like we didn't even have bias data, right? Like there were so few tests available. And I started working on this actually in sort of the early part of the pandemic, and it just was recently published. But I got really fascinated by this topic of like, well, how do you measure COVID infections if you just don't have any data, right? Like you can't test, you can't do anything. And it's a really cool problem from a Bayesian point of view because, right, as a Bayesian, you think, well, the best answer that you can give to a problem is to include all of your prior information, right? Beyond that, that's the best answer you can give. And so I started to think about that from a very kind of purely, so I've told people that this is my most Bayesian project ever. Because I just kind of was like sat down and I worked with an epidemiologist, guy, Luis Carvalho, who's also a big Stan person. He's on the Discourse site, and we worked together on this and kind of came up with a new approach. And the approach really emphasizes using priors. And so we show how you can get a decent estimate of COVID infections in this very early period, like March of 2020, by using things like expert surveys, right? Where you simply go and ask a bunch of experts, well, how many infections do you think there are? And then you have uncertainty in that estimate, right? And then you allow that uncertainty to propagate into your model, into the final estimates of COVID infections. And you essentially, you can get a pretty good estimate that's still uncertain, but actually incorporates this information that's not, that Like you don't have tests or hospitalization even. But if you take advantage of the information that you have, you can give a much better answer than just spitballing, or as many people did, assuming away uncertainty and pretending to be much more certain than they were. So that's I think some of my recent stuff that I'm always tinkering. I'm sure as you are with different things, but yeah.
Yeah, same. I always, there is always a part of me that is looking forward to the day where I will have everything figured out and understood. And that day never comes, It's like, when I will finally understand Gaussian processes, and then I think I understand, and then a new use case comes, and I'm like, wait, how do I do that? Why doesn't that work? And it's like, oh my God, I have to learn that new method, So, but I guess that's part of the job description. And that's actually the fun part, I would say. It's like you just have to reassure that other voice in your head. You're like, that's fine, that's normal, that's part of the job, and that's actually why it's fun and interesting. But yeah, congrats on all those projects. That sounds really cool, really fascinating, and interesting. That I didn't know, but the ordered beta regression. But definitely makes sense. I have some experience with the order logistic. I've used that most recently on a football analytics paper/project I'm working on. But the ordered beta, I didn't know about that, but that sounds like fun.
And yeah, I should say, it is getting used in industry. I know there's a guy from Amazon who actually wanted me to make a code change, so it could be deployed somewhere in Amazon. So I know it's out there doing something. I don't know. I guess if your Amazon order doesn't come through, then it's my package. That was the problem. But yeah, so it's getting. I'll be honest. I'm really, really happy with how the model is getting used in different places. And essentially, it really matters for predictions. Like if you fit your model and you want to, predict, okay, given this many orders, what proportion, or this many ads, what proportion will buy the product? Like you want that prediction to respect the bounds. You don't want, if you use OLS or something, and then you could end up predicting that 115% of your customers will buy a product. That doesn't make any sense. So, the ordered beta regression allows you to take into account that nonlinearity in the outcome, that, you have these bounds. And and I will say for ordered logit, again, talking about the standout mutation, but Michael Betancourt, who's, kind of a legend in the stand community, but he has an amazing case study on ordered logit. As his stuff does, it does get somewhat technical, but it's really brilliant. I've never seen anyone sort of go through the model the way he does. But if you can get through his case study, like you really understand ordered logit. And as he does, he in that case study, this is just a case study, he derives a novel distribution for the priors in an ordered logit model, the cut points. He just does it as part of the case study. Oh yeah, here's this new statistical distribution no one's ever used before. So yeah, ordered logit is really cool. And again, ordered beta, thinking, it's really about thinking out of the box, because this was an area, as I mentioned, where it's somewhat well trodden issue, and that was something where it was sort of really combining two things that are very different. So ordered logit's a model for discrete data, beta is for continuous data, and then it was really combining them that made it work, right? And so people think of statistics as a sort of dry rote, read formulas off of a page. But in a lot of, I think, actual problems, a lot of it's really creative thinking, right? How do you get stuck in a dead end? How do you find the way out? And sometimes that's taking a very different approach.
Yeah, definitely. And so we should add these links to the show notes. So if you have anything to share regarding your package on ordered beta, please add that to the show notes for the people, because I know a lot of them are gonna want to dig deeper. And I'll also add the link to Michael's case study about
we
other
should, yeah.
logistic for sure. I'll do
Yeah.
that. My project, football project, is like doesn't have anything yet that's ready to be shared, but I will do that as soon as possible, for sure.
Fun.
Maybe that's something we'll do, and we'll teach at PyData with Chris Fonspec in PyData New York in November. So maybe we'll do that. We'll see how that works.
Cool.
But yeah, maybe at that point I'll be able to share that and add that to the show notes. But in the meantime, let's add your package or any paper or case study or things like that you've written or read and think is interesting, or even videos and tutorials, and I'll add Michael's case study.
Sure.
So I know you had a hard stop in a few minutes, and I definitely want to talk about your novel. So, I mean, I still have like tons of questions for you and the work you do and how you use Bayes and so on, because honestly, I love all the work you do, and we could do like a 3-hour episode very easily. But I definitely want to talk about your novel. So let's do that, because you're the first novelist on the show. So first questions, if I were talking to you in the street or in a bar, I would be like, hey, why? What inspired you to write the Bayesian Hitman?
Yeah. My interest in writing, and this is the thing that for me, like doing statistics kind of came a little bit later in life. My interest in writing predated my doing statistics by a number of years, actually. And I was always sort of interested in writing. I got into writing fiction actually when I was a diplomat in Saudi Arabia, where, with not to put too fine a point on it, there's not very much to do in Saudi Arabia, and there's very few creative outlets. And I used to love doing things in the States. I used to actually be very much involved in improv theater at one time, and there's very little of that. But you can write a novel anywhere. And so that's actually where I got into writing. And all of that stuff that I wrote will be forever locked away in my computer and never released. But eventually I just I would write from time to time, even in grad school, as just a really nice outlet, right? It's a different way of using your brain. After I get locked into, doing research papers and stuff. And then, fiction is just so different. At least it should be. As I was posting on Twitter about this, there's some academic studies that have turned out to be fiction and have had to be retracted lately. But in theory, we're, as academics, you're not doing fiction, you're doing real research. The genesis of this novel actually came out of me being on the academic job market in the fall when I was a grad student. So my last year of grad school, I kind of had this, I don't know, as you get these sort of visions, I had this idea of someone, going to a university that wasn't their top choice, that was in an area that they didn't like, but then things being radically different than they expect, in a good way. And that was really where the idea of the novel came from, because when I was on the job market, the thing about the job market, and that I think appeals as a sort of human story, is how our lives are just so disrupted as academics. Like, people move, across their country, sometimes across the world. They end up in places that they never thought they would live. They're culturally very different. And I thought that's a really great setting for a story. I think a lot of writing advice when you're starting out that you'll get is to write what you know. And that was kind of what I knew. That was the world I was living in. One thing I want to clarify, it's not an autobiographical novel. And I always worry about that a bit. But the main character is not me. It's actually, it's set in a fictional town and with a fictional university. I did that very intentionally because I didn't want to the main character has, let's say, very uncensored opinions about his institution. And I didn't want to critique someone, an actual university or college. But the main character is very much informed by my experiences, but also by all my friends and the things they went through and the places they traveled. And I think ultimately, as I wrote in the acknowledgement of the book, I wanted it to be a novel about academia that was much more realistic. that really got into the problems people have and the issue and the challenges they face, and to try to, because I felt a lot of writing about academics, it's always these like mysterious literature professors that hang around in like, beautiful Ivy League, places and like solve crimes in their spare time or something. And I wanted to be a little more hard hitting and also really, about, life as a research academic and what that's like and the pressures you face. And so that was really the genesis. And then the main character, became about, a Bayesian statistician. I don't know. I don't remember distinctly making that choice, but the main character is a Bayesian statistician. And that became really fun because I still think, it's impossible to verify this claim, but I'd say there's a high posterior probability that it is the only novel that has a Bayesian statistician as the protagonist. And that was really fun because it's fun getting to take an area that really doesn't appear in fiction and like put it into a story and, see what happens.
Yeah. I mean, that is really interesting to see how, like, the way of thinking that got you there. And okay, so from like that was one of the scenarios I had in my head where it's like actually something you wanted to do already. And so you write, of course, academic content. How was the experience? How different was the experience? And did you enjoy it more to write the fiction? Do you feel freer writing fictional work because, you don't have to check everything, cite everything and things like that? Or was the experience in the end quite similar?
That's a great question. I think that, unfortunately, at the end, they tend to converge in some ways. But I think that's partly I'd say the initial work is very, very different. I mean, when you're writing fiction, you're really trying to feed your creative instinct. And hopefully when you're writing an academic paper, that's not hopefully you have like data that, constrains, these sorts of things. But when you're trying to get that story out for the first time, and that's a very different, and I don't know how even, how good I am at that, but that's really about just going wherever the story leads and trying to, figure out the next thing. And it's difficult, but it's definitely a very different kind of skill set or, experience than writing an academic paper. I'd say that they tend to converge at the end because, and this was, my experience. I noticed your words, my first novel, and that made me very nervous. That maybe there will be another novel, but yeah, it's not easy, and it's not easy to finish a novel. I think, it's hard to write one for sure, but it's that finishing that really, that's where you have to come back and make it coherent. And edit it. And, my book was in a kind of editing phase for 2 years, probably, of just going back and forth and adding things, taking away, trying to make the story really move at the right pace. How do you have you don't want to have too much detail or too little, and things that become even technical, like we have what are called plot holes, where, you said something happened in a certain place, but that couldn't happen because the character was here. So then, at the end of the day, when you're finishing a novel, it really comes down to a lot of details and cross-checking things and stuff that's not that different from finishing an academic paper. And that's not, the editing phase is not usually people's favorite phase unless they're kind of weird. But so I would say ultimately they start to converge. But of course, the writing style is very, very different. I do think, honestly, my advice would be, especially for academic researchers, I really encourage you to write creatively, creative fiction, creative nonfiction, poetry. No one has to see it. No one has to know. You can post it online under a, pseudonym if you want, but it actually really does help you write. And I would say, it has made my academic writing better. Academic writing at the end of the day, especially when it goes to after the peer review process, you end up responding to reviewers and anything beautiful you made gets destroyed. But also, I write a lot of blog posts. My blog posts have far greater reach than my academic writing. I'm sure of that. And those are definitely much more informed by my creative writing. And the nice thing is they're not peer reviewed. And I'm able to add tone. I'm able to add fun things, and that definitely is much more connected to my fiction writing and issues of clarity. But I'd say that you really can become a better. It's sort of like cross training as an athlete. Trying out different forms is really helpful. I'm sure that writing my novel, I didn't write it to get ahead, although I've joked with people that, part of my tenure case is writing a novel. But I don't think it'll actually will help. But I'd say, without maybe meaning to it, it definitely has made me a better writer. And that's great for my career at the end of the day.
Yeah, I'm completely agree with that. Personally, I hate reading academic papers. I do it because I have to, but each time I have to do that, I'm like, oh my God, no. Actually, something I would like to try is feed a paper to ChatGPT and ask it to rewrite it from a very, more like a novel or a more exciting tone. Because honestly, the writing is just terrible. Like, count me a story, something like that. But as you were saying, like, to your point, I really like Richard McAreef style. Because I talked a bit about that with him at StanCon. So I won't, divulge all the details because I don't know if he wants to. But long story short, is like he also, he definitely trained his writing styles, and he's aware of things he wants to do, how he wants to do it. And I think that's also a big part of why his book has been so successful. Because the writing is so much more engaging. And I've never understood that, honestly, from the academic world, where it's like, oh no, like, it seems like to look serious, you have to be as boring as possible. And that's just terrible. It's like, that doesn't make people want to read papers. I'm not saying it should be, completely entertaining, and not saying it should be TikTok on papers, on the contrary, but people like stories, and if you can tell stories and at the same time teach them something or show them a new method, I think that's much better. Everybody wins, and I think it's also much more enjoyable for the writer. So why not do a little bit more of that? So that's why I think it's awesome that Richard writes that way, that you also likes to write that way, and you're even writing novels. I think that's awesome, and that's probably going to change, gradually. I know other authors also doing that. Osvaldo Martin, for instance, who's going to be back on the show next week. Osvaldo was the first ever guest of Learning Bayesian Statistics. Episode 1 was with him 5 years ago, and he's been kind of a mentor to me, and I really like his style of writing. For instance, also he's someone with a lot of humor, so that you can see that in the writing. And also I like it because he doesn't drown you with technical details from the get-go. His writing is much more applied, where it's like, okay, let me tell you about Bayesian additive regression trees. Here's the theory you need to know, but not too much. Okay, here is how we do it. Here are the limitations and so on. And I think that's much more efficient and also much more engaging.
Yeah, totally. And I think blogs have changed statistics. They've maybe even helped create data science, because it's this form of publishing that allows us to just skirt around the whole archaic academic system. And especially for listeners who aren't, let's say, aren't as plugged into academia, haven't been through like the paper publishing process. I mean, reviewers really do, like, even if you try to, if you write a paper better, it'll be a better paper. But they really, I've had reviewers like kill titles because they didn't think that they were like academic-y enough. So, and the title I had to replace it with was definitely like a worse title. right? So, and I've had reviewers like comment say your writing style is too informal, like nothing to do with the actual substance of the paper. Just this doesn't sound, technical. So, when you're reading an academic paper and it's turgid, it's like, well, some of that is, I mean, and also, I mean, some people just aren't like struggle to write. Some people, English is not a language they're very comfortable with. And so, there's not everyone's going to be Richard McElreath. Like that guy has a gift. Okay. But I think too, blogs allow people to, just completely do an end run around that. The other person I'll mention who's fantastic blogger on stats issues, I don't know if he would explicitly say he's Bayesian, but a lot of his stuff is Andrew Heiss. He's a fellow political scientist at Georgia State. And we can put his link in the blog. And he is, I think, really one of the best sort of stats bloggers out there, because he has a remarkable gift for visualization, but he's also very good at sort of the explanation side. And so if there's people listening who have not added him to their list, I mean, he's really great at, and very applied, like the embedded code chunks in the blog and stuff. So yeah, and I mean, so I think this is all fantastic. And, the only challenge, and I know as an academic who does some blogging, is, we're not paid to do it. And it is a public good. And when I say we're not paid to do it, I mean, theoretically, yes, like anything you do as academic, you're quote unquote paid for, but it's not really part of your evaluation. Most people ignore it, right, for tenure and for these sorts of things. And so I'd say it's not incentivized. It's up to people to do it yourself. I think my projects have I mean, I think some of my blog posts that, relate to my academic work, they help with, let's say, getting citations. But at the end of the day, it's something that you kind of have to want to do. But I would say personally, I found it just be so rewarding to write that way, and to see stuff get out there, in the world. I'll just throw this in. It's just a funny tidbit. My most visited blog post for years now is actually a blog post I wrote about a pregnancy test called a cell-free pregnancy screening for Down syndrome. Which, if you know anything about Bayesian statistics, right, testing is this like core part. It's like the example all the intro books use, some kind of how many vampires are in the population or whatever. And so this blog post came out of actually a very personal story of my wife and I having a child who was tested or recommended for testing. And to make a long story short, I was really upset about how these tests were being interpreted in a way that was like statistically invalid, right? Not being aware of like prior distributions and how they affect the interpretation of the test. So I wrote a blog post about this, and I tried to make it very, very clear, like even like to people who have no stats background, right? And I mean, it's just my personal blog. I just posted it up there, and somehow it's become one of the top Google search results for this particular test. It's called Maternity 21. Like it's a top 5. So it gets like 100 unique views a week, sometimes higher than that, of people. And I've gotten like emails from people all over the world. And sometimes I have to say, I'm sorry, I'm not a medical doctor. I'm just commenting on, how you correctly interpret the statistics of a test. But like that's like, as an academic, like that's really cool to have that kind of impact. And I thought that was going to be a post I wrote that would be quickly forgotten, but ended up, it's people read it all the time, and hopefully make fewer statistical errors, right? From using those tests. But anyway, yeah.
Yeah, for sure. That's cool, because that was actually going to be a question I had for you. Like the way you saw your novel and your writing in general contribute to public understanding of Bayesian stats and scientific thinking in general. But since we're short on time, because I think you have to leave in like 14 minutes. I'm gonna. So I have the last two questions to ask you that I ask every guest at the end of the show. But before that, one last question regarding your novel. Did you get any feedback already from your academic peers and readers? And what kind of feedback was it?
Not a ton yet. I mean, the novel's only been out for a month, and we're all busy. So the people who have read it really like it. Of course, as a Bayesian statistician who works on, I know that like the reported feedback is not always the same as the true feedback, right? That's a latent quantity.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So that being said, I mean, the way I would interpret people's feedback so far is that, wow, this novel is actually like not that bad. Meaning, like, I mean, it has a sort of claim to fame as being one of the first novels of the Bayesian statistician and protagonist, but that doesn't mean that it's actually fun to read. But the people who have gotten through it said, oh, it's actually like well paced. There's some kind of mystery thriller elements in it. The plot moves along nicely. They enjoyed it, and that's honestly what I want people to take from it at the end of the day. There are some things in the book that, if you know me, are probably not surprising. Like some things get into some questions about, science, what is it about, philosophy of science, things like this. But it's not too heavy-handed, and it's fun, and that it's a little bit escapist, and that's what I wanted, was for people who do research to have a fun book to read and enjoy it. It doesn't get super into the weeds on Bayesian stats. There is some, and actually, you mentioned Gaussian processes. That's one of the few. But there is actually a time when the characters sort of make fun of Gaussian process regression. So I was very happy that ended up in the novel. And maybe I'll get angry emails from people who love Gaussian processes.
From me. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, but I'd say if you understand Bayesian statistics, you'll understand more of what the main character is doing. I don't like write out, models in the book. But you'll have a much better sense of the technical side of what's happening. But in the novel, I tried to make it, more fun for people, even people who don't have a background at all in statistics and stuff like that.
Cool.
So it's still early for, there's a lot of people who have the book and are reading it. If the pilot distribution of feedback is the same as the true distribution, so far people enjoyed it. So, yeah.
Nice. Yeah, that's awesome, and well done again for taking the time of doing that, because I know how long it takes to write a book and how much dedication and sacrifice of free time it asks for. So thanks a lot for doing that. I think it's super important for science communication, and I do think we should teach science from much more of a storytelling perspective, because science is done by people. So this is not just a bunch of dry theorems on paper.
Right.
So I think your novel definitely contributes to that. So thanks a lot, Bob.
Yeah. Sure.
And now, so I need to ask you the last two questions before you can get out to your next engagement. So first one, if you had unlimited time and resources, which problem would you try to solve? And the caveat is that you have to solve it with the Gaussian process. No, of course not. It's just what problem if you had unlimited time and resources?
Yeah, unlimited time and resources. Well, I would buy a football team. No, I'm kidding. Important problem for the world. I have actually thought about this, but I do a lot of work with online surveys, and I do think that we haven't really fully exploited them, and social, like, people maybe shouldn't be on social media as much as they are, but they're on it a ton. And there's incredible possibilities through that for data collection. And one thing that I think would be really cool would be to do like real-time online surveys across the whole world that are, that happen almost every day, right? So this is, I guess, like the social scientist, dream. But for some of the stuff I study, like, corruption, like have people report issues of corruption or, what's happening with their business or things that look shady. Having a survey like that would run around the world all the time, every day, would be pretty awesome. Facebook did this during COVID. They had a COVID poll, and made me so jealous because they could because they're Facebook, they could just have this thing appear on people's, feeds. It would just pop up and say, you want to take a survey about COVID. So there's this incredible data out there of daily, sometimes it gets down to the county or state level of, how many, stuff like, how much contact do people have with other people. We have this information for literally almost the entire world. It's just stunning. And so I would love to do that kind of thing about, topics I care about, like corruption, and just see, because in general in academia, we do, the most we get away with is a sort of point in time survey. Here's what people thought about President Trump at this particular time. But longitudinal data is so much more interesting. And there's so many more important questions you can ask. We can get into things like, when do people change their minds? How do they change their minds? Even with the current election, which we haven't discussed yet. So we have to discuss that, right? There's all this, conversation about, well, who supports, Kamala Harris, who supports Donald Trump. And the thing is, we don't really have longitudinal data, so we really don't know who's changed their mind or not, because we don't know. People answer a survey and they say which one they like at the moment, but does that mean they really changed their mind, or just that's who they saw on TV last night? That's the most recent candidate they've heard of. What we really want to know are people who used to support one candidate and now they support another. Those are the really interesting ones. So that's sort of my dream ambition. Maybe that's a very uninteresting dream ambition, but that would be one thing I would love to do. And it really would require unlimited funding. So if you know of a source of unlimited funding, please put me in touch.
Yeah, I mean, if I'll first use it, and then I'll tell you I have one. No, yeah, great answer. And I'm not surprised. You seem like you really are passionate about what you're doing. So not surprised you came up with a very appropriate answer, and of course, very nerdy answer. I was really hoping for that. That's a prerequisite to be on the show. So
Yeah.
And so second question. If you could have dinner with any great scientific mind, dead, alive, or fictional, who would it be?
Yeah. So this is a great question, and one I've had to think about, but it ended up being actually very clear for me, and that's Leonardo da Vinci. I've always heard about him. I took a trip to Italy a few years ago, and there's a museum of Leonardo da Vinci. I believe it's in Rome, but don't quote me on that. That's not if I remember correctly, it was in Rome. And it wasn't the biggest museum, but it was so fascinating. And what I loved about this guy, and this kind of relates to our conversation, right, about statisticians writing novels. This guy had no rules, right? And he would, he'd wake up one day, he'd paint the Mona Lisa. He'd wake up the next day, he'd invent a new way to build a dam. And no one was there to tell him hey, you should, no, you're an artist. You should just stay painting all the time. Or, oh my gosh, you're really good at, science. You should, just write scientific treatises. He just decided he was going to do it all. Now, obviously, he was tremendously gifted. And maybe there's not another person alive who, has ever been that multi-talented. But I just think that's so fascinating. His scientific discoveries probably don't measure up to, let's say, Newton or Bacon or Einstein. But I think as a person, he's fascinating in the way that he's doing art, he's doing science, and the two can blend together. And so I think for me, hands down, I just love to sit down and chat with him. And where did you get your ideas from, right? Where did they just a steady stream of insights? And, you look him up, I mean, his contributions across fields are staggering, right? So that's that he gets my vote. If you can set that up too, that'd be great. If you know how to bring dead people to life or whatever. So.
Well, I definitely will, and I will join the dinner because honestly, I think it's a great choice. Some other people also have made that choice, so that will be a very interesting dinner. Yeah.
I thought it was super original, but I guess not. That's okay.
I mean, it is original. It's not, it's not the bulk of the distribution, but
Okay.
you're not the first one.
Yeah.
But
That's fine.
yeah, it's a great one. It would have been very original if you wanted to optimize that to say myself,
If you have the source of unlimited funding, yeah, then I would definitely be saying that. So.
Yeah, I will. Yeah, and so if you like Leonardo da Vinci stuff, as I do, there is in my native region in France, there is his last house, which was offered to him, gifted to him by the King of France, Francis I. And at the time, the king was in the small city of Amboise, which is in the Loire Valley. And so if you go so I definitely recommend the region, because it's really beautiful. It's the same vibe as Tuscany, since Italy, but without the mountains, but it's great food, great wine, lots of history, lots of castles. And so Leonardo da Vinci spent his last years in Amboise, and his castle, which is called the Clos Lucé, is actually a museum now that you can visit. Lots of his inventions are there, some even handwritten notes, always very original, because he was writing with the left hand from right to left. So it's very hard to decipher, actually. There's an amazing park, and there is also a bit of, there are some vines, because he was making some wine. Definitely recommend that. That's a really beautiful place.
That sounds fascinating. And I didn't need another reason to go visit France, but you've given me another one. So I'll have another excuse to visit for sure. Yeah. Thank you.
And it's also it's not a very touristic one. I mean, it is touristic, but it's mainly European tourism and some Americans. So it's not, I mean, now that I've talked on the podcast, of course, it's going to become, much more touristic, because I'm kind of an influencer, but, it's just
all these really nerdy people will show up and, stand t-shirts and stuff. Yeah. Did you get a stand t-shirt at the conference, or?
No, I don't think there were t-shirts this year, but I have some cool stickers. Stickers.
Okay. Yeah, they have stickers. Yeah. I got a t-shirt back when, but I will say, the first stand conference, I wouldn't say it was the best, because I think probably the quality's, there's so many more people use stand, but it was in California on the coast. Like they had a resort that was on the Pacific. It was very pretty.
Cool.
Yeah, it was really fun, but.
Oh, damn. Yeah. No, this year was in Oxford University, so as expected, gorgeous. It was raining.
Yeah. but the university is pretty cool to look at.
Yeah. No, that's absolutely beautiful. And again, you go to the UK, you expect it to be raining. So that's fine. It's like going to France and not expecting some strikes. It's like you're missing part of the experience. So.
Yeah, for sure.
Awesome. Well, Bob, I need to let you go. I know you have another engagement, but thank you so much for taking the time. That was absolutely great. Awesome conversation. I have still gazillion questions for you, but let's do that when your next novel comes around. So you told me in about 3 months, right? So that's awesome.
Oh my gosh.
And as usual, I'll put resources and a link to your website in the show notes for those who want to dig deeper. Thank you again, Bob, for taking the time and being on this show.
Thank you, man. I had a great time, and I'll definitely get everything else to you. But thanks so much. It was so fun to have this conversation. You asked great questions. You made me think a lot. So I really appreciate it. I hope you have a good week.
This has been another episode of Learning Bayesian Statistics. Be sure to rate, review, and follow the show on your favorite podcatcher, and visit learnbasedstats.com for more resources about today's topics, as well as access to more episodes to help you reach true Bayesian state of mind. That's learnbasedstats.com. Our theme music is Good Bayesian by Baba Brinkman, feat. MC Lars and Megaran. Check out his awesome work at bababrinkman.com. I'm your host, Alex Andorra. You can follow me on Twitter at Alex_Andorra like the country. You can support the show and unlock exclusive benefits by visiting patreon.com/learnbayesstats. Thank you so much for listening and for your support. You're truly a
good Bayesian. Change your predictions after taking information in. And if you're thinking I'll be less than amazing, let's adjust those expectations. Let me show you how to be a good Bayesian. Change calculations after taking fresh data in. Those predictions that your brain is making, let's get them on a solid foundation.